And I'll go ahead and start with the introduction that we have. Thank you everyone for coming tonight. This is the last lecture in the Southern Foodways lecture series. We've learned about so much food. As a reminder, you can submit recipes to our community cookbook until September 30th using this link, which I'm about to send to everybody in the chat. Also, if you have any questions during the lecture and would like it to be answered, please type them into the chat box where the link just appeared, and she will be able to answer them at the end of the talk. Additionally, this lecture will be recorded and will be available to view on YouTube later. Cap off our lecture series tonight, we have Dr., I hope I say your name right, Hesha Diner.
It's good enough.
Okay. And she is a professor of American Jewish history from New York University. She specializes in American Jewish history and women's history, and she will be discussing Jewish American food traditions tonight. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. And actually, the pronunciation is Hasia, but that is just fine. So really, thank you so much for having me and for your nice words. I'm really pleased to be here. Now, I'm going to actually give my talk primarily about Southern Jewish food, since that's what I really understood the your larger project to be, but I can certainly answer in the Q&A questions beyond the South. So it's a wonderful topic. Your whole series on Southern foodways is really important. It's very rich. It's a great way to think about the region that is the American South. And in the context of thinking about Jewish history, it's a very suggestive way to think about Jews and how they fit into particular places where they settled, to the regions where they settled, and what adjustments they made based on being in those places. So before going into the specifics of Southern Jewish foodways, I want to emphasize a kind of basic principle, which is that wherever, and I really mean wherever, okay, Jews settled in their long millennia, long history of migration, food was really important, as they had no choice, like any other people, of cooking, of eating, and of carving out distinctive identities with food as one of the markers of who they were, both in relationship to the other people around them and in relationship to other Jews. Food was what made them, let's say, Salonican Jews or Lithuanian Jews or Andalusian Jews or Moroccan Jews, Lithuanian Jews. And in this context, for our talk tonight, it's one of the things that made them Southern Jews, with an emphasis on both. In all of those places that I just mentioned, again, Salonika, Lithuania, Andalus, and the American South, as well as Morocco, Yemen, Provence, Ukraine, and many, many, many more, at some point, Jews arrived as migrants, and they did two things in terms of their relationship to food. So first, wherever they went and wherever they came from, they went about recreating the foods they had eaten before. And importantly, when we think about Jewish history and Jewish eating, they, for most of their history, gave tremendous importance to finding ways to maintain the Jewish dietary laws, not eating pork and shellfish, eating food that was only ritually slaughtered, and separating meat and milk, among many, many other details. So wherever they went, they tried to recreate the foods they had known before, but also wherever they went, okay, they made use of the ingredients of the new place. They adopted the novelties of the place around them, merged those novelties with their old foodways, and kind of created something really new. Now, much of this was by necessity. It wasn't that they set out to do this, but if they left one place and went to another, they just couldn't eat the way they had. So just as one example, Jews who left Spain in the 15th century and went to the Netherlands, they didn't have olive oil and they didn't have oranges and they didn't have cinnamon and currants and so on. They had no choice but to improvise and substitute the items they had had before with the what was available to them in the new place. So similarly, and again, I'm going to try to keep using Southern examples, a Jew who moved from Lithuania to the United States, settling first in New York and then coming to, let's say, Mississippi, which a not insignificant number of did, they might still eat a sweet kugel, a kind of pudding-like dish on their Friday night, their Sabbath feast, but living in Mississippi or Louisiana or South Carolina, the pudding might now have pecans rather than walnuts. It might have peaches rather than apples. A Jew making that move, again, Lithuania, New York, the American South, might put on her or his table collard greens, something they'd never had before, as well as rice, very unknown commodity back home, black-eyed peas, along with those dishes that they defined as traditional Jewish dishes. So interestingly, one of the items that Jews who came to the American South adapted very early on were grits. Okay, very Southern food. I remember my first bowl of grits visiting somebody in North Carolina. So grits being cornmeal mush, essentially. And interestingly, the grits had a pre-migration equivalent for Jews who had come from Romania. In Romania, it was called mamaliga. It was the same staple, the cornmeal mush, but in Lithuania, in Romania, it had not been drenched in cheese or butter. But that is how they came in Charleston or in Mississippi or North Carolina to eat their what was once mamaliga and now grits. So this is a universal story of immigrants wherever they came from and wherever they went to, adapting. And Jews were, like in that case, all other immigrants at all times and all places. But obviously for Jews, there was a special or a particular issue that came with this adaptation, and these were the kosher laws. That is, Jews came to the American South starting in the 18th century with an idea that they must keep kosher, and that we'll see as the lecture goes on, it proved to be something of a problem for them, because when they came to their new places, including the southern United States, they saw, obviously very important in thinking about food is what people see in the marketplaces, on the streets, and so on. They smelled, okay, a really important part of also thinking about food innovation. And they came to covet, to really express a positive feeling about the foods that their neighbors ate. And they, for most of their history in the American South, found ways to, let's say, kosherize, to make kosher the foods that were new to them in this new place. So I'm going to give you two examples. So one, Baltimore, we know, and I consider Baltimore the South. It's a bit of a border state, but Baltimore is the home of crabs and crab cakes. Well, Baltimore Jews for decades, and in fact, even into the present, made their variant on the kind of iconic crab cakes, which they couldn't eat if they were observing kashrut, okay, the dietary laws. And Baltimore Jews created a dish called coddies, which were essentially cod cakes. So these are made out of cod, very kosher, totally kosher, They looked like crab cakes. They had that same breading on the outside, fried, crunchy, but soft inside. No doubt delicious as a crab cake, but kosher. So the simple kadi we might think of is something that allowed Baltimore Jews to be good Jews as they understood it, and real and integrated Baltimoreans. Or so too throughout the South, the home of barbecue. Clearly, barbecue reigned and reigns supreme as family food, as a food of community celebration, and as something that's kind of almost a part of the Southern food economy, restaurants, crossroads stands, and so on. And for Jews, rather than not join in the consumption of barbecue, started barbecuing beef brisket, a very traditional Jewish, East European Jewish cut of meat. But that brisket, kosher, okay, acceptable, which is what kosher means, but like the pork that their neighbors were eating, got slathered with sauce, seared, baked, or smoked, and eaten with great gusto. So Jewish food in all the places Jews lived resembled the foods of their neighbors, whether it was wheat or rice or potatoes, spicy food, bland food, stewed, fried, baked, using cabbage, spinach, okra, raisins, apple, pomegranate, apricot, freshwater fish, whatever. And Jews, like our Baltimore Jews, cooked those items and ate them like others around them, but with the twist that it included, for again, most of history conforming to the the kosher rules. And also those foods were consumed in particular ways on the Jewish Sabbath, which was obviously very different than the Christian Sabbath, and on Jewish holidays. So the American Jews in the American South, Jews, we should think about Jews who came there as representing a kind of Jewish melting pot, because particularly in the bigger cities, Jews from multiple places lived with each other, and they each had their own distinctive foodways. So in the 18th century, Jews, Sephardim, which Sephardim means Spanish, were women and men whose ancestors had come from the Iberian Peninsula to Amsterdam or to London, and then to the Caribbean, and then to Charleston and Savannah. And they had food of those places. And when they came to Charleston and Savannah and elsewhere in the American South, they bumped up against and ate with, and in fact married, Jews who we call Ashkenazim, that is the Jews of Central and Eastern Europe, who also had their ideas and preferences about food. And we could say family by family, community by community, Jews negotiated with each other over which food practices should predominate, the Ashkenazic, the Sephardic, or the creation of a kind of melange. Okay, likewise, in Louisiana, many of the Jews came from Alsace, okay, French-speaking region. So not surprising that they're coming to Louisiana, a French-speaking region bordering on Germany. And in Louisiana, over time, they were met by Jews from Romania, okay, consumers of Mamaliga, from Lithuania, Galicia, and so on. And again, they shared foods and created something that was distinctive to the Louisiana region. Or in late 19th century Atlanta, there was an influx of Jews from Rhodes and other parts of what we would call what is now Greece, other parts of the Balkan. And once again, they brought their distinctive foodways, which met, sometimes clashed, but ultimately gets integrated with the foods of other Jews. And so all of these internal Jewish food fusions were taking place. And I think one of the things that they learned these Jews from, let's say, Rhodes coming to Atlanta and meeting Jews who from Lithuania or from Germany, from the German-speaking lands, came to realize that in the American South, this profoundly Christian environment, being Jewish was more important than the places from which they had come. Now, finally, before we get to the South itself, and obviously when I say the South, we have to keep in mind that there are many Souths. There's the urban South, Baltimore, New Orleans, Arkansas, South Carolina, and so on. We should keep in mind that by the time Jews begin to come to the United States, to North America, and particularly after in the 19th century to the United States, they came as part of a kind of modernization of Judaism. This involved a certain drift away from traditional practices, a slow rejection in everyday behavior and in ideology of the long-standing, again, millennia-old idea that Jews must live a certain way and Jews must eat according to the dietary laws. That is, increasing numbers of Jews from, again, the early 19th century onward declared in their words and in their actions that you can still be a good Jew and eat a crab cake. Okay, you can still be a good Jew and eat barbecued pork. The kadi or the barbecued brisket doesn't make a Jew, but communal association and participation in communal events, that's what makes a Jew and not what you eat. Now, just to add to that kind of drift away from observance is the fact that Jews who came to new places at the beginning of their settlement came to places where it was really hard to maintain the kosher laws. Those laws required a ritual slaughterer. They required somebody to supervise. They required usually rabbis who would make some determination if an item was kosher or not. And when they would come to these new places, those individuals were not there. And individual Jews had to make their own decisions on their own. So there's a wonderful story of a man named Cyrus Adler, who was from Philadelphia, but moved to Arkansas. His father, I'm sorry, moved to Arkansas. And before he went from Philadelphia to Arkansas, an uncle taught him how to slaughter his own chickens, because down in Arkansas, there were going to be no kosher slaughterers to do that for him. So he, in a sense, in his own hands, took the making of kashrut. Now, in all of these stories that I have been telling and that I'm going to tell, time matters. And this is obviously about history. And a Jew moving to Atlanta in 1940 was moving to a very different place than a Jew moving to Atlanta in, say, 1870. Okay, by 1940, there was the whole infrastructure of Jewish food purveyors and kosher supervision. So too, transportation was important, and that's obviously also about time, changes in transportation. So in the 18th century, Jews in the British colonies of North America got kosher meat from England, actually primarily from the Irish city of Cork. And somebody would put barrels of kosher salted meat on an ocean-going voyage, and it would then arrive in the port of New York or the port of Charleston. Obviously, in the 20th century, meat does not have to be imported. Kosher meat does not have to be imported to the United States. So let's turn to the South itself and what made this very important. Okay, before we get into the specifics of the South, I just want to say that food in the American, Jewish food or food, any kind of food in any region, okay, is a very important way of forging family and community events, weddings, confirmations. For Jews, it will be bar or bat mitzvah. funerals, so many other events, home hospitality, where food was used to forge community. Food for Jews, like all other peoples, was a way to announce belonging. Okay, family events, religious events, social events, shops, commercial spaces, okay, were places where food was eaten and people within a community fed each other. So as such, food is a kind of wall, okay? It's a wall in as much as uh, community, which is a bounded entity, is consumed within that community. But we're going to see in the course of the next minutes or so that food in many places, but particularly in the American South, for Jews was also a bridge. So let's ask the question, what were the specifics of Jewish foodways in the American South? What about the American South impacted Jewish foodways? So I'm going to have 4 points. Okay. So first, for the most part, Jews in the South, from the middle of the 19th century onward, lived in small enclaves spread out in the rural countryside. Now, obviously, New Orleans, Charleston, Savannah, Memphis, Nashville, Atlanta had larger Jewish populations. But in fact, all of those places were once kind of frontier towns where Jews were among the first white residents, and they lived in tiny numbers. And so Jews lived in relatively small enclaves, and for the most part, Southern Jews, most of whom were shopkeepers, they owned dry goods stores, they owned stores that sold men's clothing or women's clothing. In particular, were shopkeepers in small towns, places that had small Jewish communities: Port Gibson, Mississippi, Helena, Arkansas, Tyler, Texas, Fitzgerald, Georgia, and so many, many more. Jews in these places lived in minuscule communities with little infrastructure for the kosher laws. And since the South was the least urbanized region of the United States, the rural basis of its economy shaped Jewish life as well. So for the Jews who went to these places, again, Port Gibson, Mississippi, or Helena, Arkansas, or Fitzgerald, Georgia, they came there because of the benefits of doing business in a small town. And they said this was a great place to make a living. And they calculated that they would rather make a good living in Port Gibson, Mississippi, than strictly observe the laws of kashrut, the kosher laws. They saw an economic niche in these small southern towns, and they went for it. And having gone for these places, it made it nigh impossible for them to observe the laws. Now, at times, Jews in these towns organized themselves so that one of them, let's say going to Baltimore or going to Charleston to do business, would also pick up kosher meat for everyone else. Or in the 19th century, we know, and even the early 20th, itinerant kosher slaughterers would come through southern towns right before Passover and the high holy days to do butchering. So for the holidays, Jews would have kosher meat, even if they didn't have it the other times of the year. And sometimes in these small Jewish communities, people would make arrangements with friends and relatives in a bigger city to put a kind of packages of kosher meat on a regularly scheduled train, so that, and then somebody would meet the train and then pass out the kosher meat. But all of these were obviously makeshift, and they helped, in a way, push Southern Jews away from strict observance. Now, in context of this, I should have said that the South, probably more than any other region of the United States, was really based on pork consumption. I mean, it was pork eaters' paradise. Okay, so that's one point, is that Jews lived in these small towns, and in the small towns, keeping kosher was pretty hard. Secondly, and perhaps actually my second point should have come before my first point, this region we call the South, more than any other region of the United States to which Jews went, was a destination for peddlers. Okay, young Jewish men from Alsace, to Louisiana, Romania, Bavaria, and so on, and Lithuania, came to America and to the South with a plan that they could make a living and a new life for themselves by strapping a pack on their back and going into the hinterlands selling goods, buttons, thread, needles, mirrors, eyeglasses, pots, pans, towels, and so on, going farm to farm, plantation to plantation, sometimes to the workers in textile mills, lumber camps, and so on. Jewish men did this all over the United States and indeed all over the New World, but the South was a kind of peddler's province more than any place else. So the peddlers who sold first by foot, they walked the roads and then they got horses and wagons, had a weekly circuit. They would go out on the road on Sunday and they would sell. They always had the same customers every day of the week. And on Friday, they would go back to the larger towns where there was a Jewish population. Here they would pay off their debt to their creditors. They would enjoy the Sabbath, and then they would go back out on the road, selling again to those same customers because the peddlers sold on credit. So this routine, being out on the road 5 nights a week, immediately asks the question, what did they eat? Okay, if Sunday through Thursday they were on the road, could they keep kosher? How would they feed themselves? And how would they get food? And so one thing we know is that most of these peddlers spent the night, they lodged for the night at the home of their last customer, be that customer Black or that customer white. Sometimes the peddler would pay the customer for lodging, or sometimes they would let them take an extra special item out of their bag. But either way, they slept at the customers' homes, which meant that they ate in the customers' homes. And in most cases, from the evidence we have, the families were happy to have the peddlers stay off, and they graciously invited the peddlers to their tables. Peddlers in their memoirs, which aren't too many, but would sit down at a table, a Southern table, and find in front of them bowls and platters of pork, of ham and bacon and collard greens and biscuits made with lard and greens cooked with pork fatback and pork chops, as well as rabbit and squirrel. And at times the peddler said, "I cannot eat your food." To which the housewife said, "Well, why can't you eat it?" And the answer was always, "My religion doesn't allow it." And the peddler had to explain he was a Jew and he couldn't eat this. From the evidence we have, most of these housewives said, "Okay, that's fine. Tell me what you can eat and I will make it for you." It didn't inspire hostility, but rather, one might say, a kind of ecumenical friendship over the table. Now, there are other narratives, other stories we have of peddlers who maybe they thought for a minute, "I don't want to eat the ham," or "I don't want to eat the larded biscuits or the greens. But you know what? After a day on the road carrying 100 pounds on my back, by gosh, I'm going to eat whatever is served to me." And whatever it is they thought about it, they ate it. And there's one lovely memoir of a man, a peddler in Alabama, who sat down at a table with his customers, wolfing down the foods in front of him. And there happened to be a visiting Protestant minister sitting there. And the minister said to the peddler, "I thought Moses made laws that said the Jewish people could not eat the flesh of the swine." The peddler thought for a minute and he said, "You know, if Moses had come to Alabama, he wouldn't have made those laws." So it's a funny story, it's revealing, but it shows us that the decisions about food that Jews made were about both the confrontation with the forbidden and how circumstances push them to eat in a particular way. Okay, or push them to say, you know, "I'm going to eat whatever is served to me." Now, I don't want to say that no Southern Jews observed kashrut. The Cyrus Adler story told us that. The Baltimore Coddy story told us that. And in the larger Jewish cities, again, Baltimore, Richmond, Charleston, Savannah, New Orleans, there were kosher butchers who plied their trade. There were kosher restaurants, kosher caterers, and in some ways, no different than Omaha or Boston or any other place. But again, the small Jewish communities made kashrut possible. Made kashrut difficult. Peddling made kashrut difficult, and we see that drift away from a tradition. Thirdly, Southern Jewish foodways reflected the fact that Jews were pretty integrated into the South. For a whole range of reasons, they experienced much greater integration, acceptance, accommodation by the white non-Jews among whom they lived. And they didn't live necessarily, other than in the biggest cities, in Jewish neighborhoods. And they came to interact positively with their non-Jewish neighbors, schools, sitting on, holding political office, membership on boards of one kind or another, which meant that Southern Jews were more than their other Jews, let's say in the urban Northeast, in situations where they had the opportunity or the challenge, depending on how you want to think of it, of eating with their non-Jewish neighbors. Work lunches, work snack breaks, the store picnic, the any kind of gathering where people socialized and ate. If Jews were socializing with non-Jews more in the South than elsewhere, that meant they had more opportunity to eat with others more than other Jews. Okay, and then finally, the final context that makes the South different, and it's obviously one cannot avoid it at all, is that Southern Jewish foodways cannot be disassociated with that element, with the region's history, its probably most distinctive characteristic, namely the institution of slavery and the enduring profound issue of race, which still impacts all aspects of Southern life to this day, and obviously all aspects of American life. The divide in the South between white privilege and the subordination, subjugation, and discrimination against Black people begins at the beginning, 1619, and continued. Now, slavery existed elsewhere other than the South. It was a big institution in New York, but it just ended so much later in the South. And other parts of the United States also had the vast inequalities in terms of income and justice and rights. But until the 1960s, the majority of American Blacks lived in the South, and the South, more than any other region, took its shape from the Black, white, unprivileged, privileged divide. So as to food and Jews, Southern Jews, like all Southern white people, ate food whether they admitted it or not, were introduced by the enslaved. Yams, rice, gumbo, fried chicken, jambalaya, black-eyed peas, and more. Some of these were ingredients or dishes that indeed were brought to America by the kidnapped Africans, while others were European or British dishes, but profoundly Africanized by the Black women who were forced to work in the kitchens of their enslavers. Some ingredients were local, let's say corn, but the cooks who transformed them into grits or hoe cakes or other items were women of African background, and they put into those dishes their ideas about food. Some of these, particularly those associated with Louisiana, not only grew out of the African connection, but out of the Caribbean connection as well. So Jews, slavery, post-slavery, race, and food. Okay, so before the Civil War, Jews owned slaves. Okay, they did so, in fact, at a higher rate than most white people. Okay, in the pre-Civil War South, only 1 out of 25 white people owned a slave, whereas among Jews, it was 1 out of 10. Jewish families in the decades before emancipation and the end of slavery had their daily Sabbath and holiday meals prepared by African women in bondage, pure and simple. And the Jewish housewives, that is, we can say that women were the ones most involved in the world of the kitchen, whether they had come to the United States from Alsace or Lithuania or Galicia and or whatever, had foods were put on the table that had been prepared by women from various parts of Africa, from primarily West Africa. The Jewish housewives before and then after slavery instructed Black women, enslaved and then free, in their kitchens how to cook familiar but ultimately novel foods from back home: kugels, gefilte fish, chicken soup, knedlach, that is matzo balls, latkes, blintzes, and the like. That is, this European Jewish woman is teaching her Black cooks, enslaved or then free, how to make Jewish food. Some of the Jewish housewives, both during and beyond slavery, who depended upon the kitchen labor of Black women, had to teach them what it meant. How do you separate dairy from meat? It's not such an obvious thing. How to make sure that a meat fork didn't slip into a cabinet with forks being used for dairy. For Southern Jews who observed Passover, which I think most did, certainly for some period of time, the white Jewish woman had to teach her Black cook, again, either a slave or not, how do you remove all the bread stuff, the chametz, okay, the forbidden leavened food from the kitchen and from the house, and how do you cook special for Passover? How do you make fried chicken with matzah meal rather than with bread? So the Black women who worked in these Jewish kitchens served as the individuals who put food on Jewish tables. Southern Black women laboring in the kitchens of Jewish families put their stamp on Jewish foods. So Jewish foods cooked by Black women in the South became crispier, became more peppery, became spicier than those foods had been in Eastern Europe. They made latkes, what's usually considered to be potato pancakes, out of yams. They transformed knedlach, matzo balls, into the side dish to go with gumbo or jambalaya. They put cayenne in a cuisine that in Europe would have never heard of cayenne, but had been the only spice in Europe that they had used was garlic. So I think we really need to pay attention to this racial dynamic in Southern Jewish foodways, and to keep in mind that the Black women who are working in the Jewish homes, cooking and cleaning and chopping and mincing and doing all that kitchen work, were not doing that for their own families because they had to work in order to stay alive. So I want to use, just as a kind of close, one memoir, really wonderful book that I highly recommend by Stella Suberman, called The Jew Store. It's a memoir of Suberman herself. It's her own memoir. Growing up in a family store in a small town in Tennessee, her family owned a store called A Jew Store. Her parents, Reba and Aaron, were immigrants from Eastern Europe. They came to New York. They decided they really couldn't do much with themselves, working as factory operatives in a garment shop. So they moved to the South on the advice of a friend, and they came to this small town in Tennessee. And while her parents pined for life in a larger Jewish community, they wanted much more Jewish stuff in their lives, more Jewish companionship. They, in fact, did pretty well. And like all the other Jews, they could afford, like they couldn't if they had stayed in New York, they could afford to have a live-in servant, a Black woman named Lizzie May. Suberman, the author of the memoir, offers details of Lizzie May's cooking and her pride in making all the East European dishes that the family liked. And because of Lizzie May, the family could eat what they wanted. And with, however, a clear note, Suberman, a memoirist, said that Lizzie May was always there, and that meant that Reba, Suberman's mother, didn't have to could always have a hot meal on Saturday. because Lizzie May lived in, and she would always keep the fire going on the Sabbath, which is forbidden by Jewish law. And so their ability to have a home cooked hot meal on Saturday was all due to Lizzie May. So it's a wonderful book. I would even say it's delightful, but it forces us to see the world of Southern Jewish food is built upon the labor of other women who, while they cooked and chopped and broiled and fried, minced and peeled, set the tables, washed the dishes, laundered the tablecloths, took out the garbage for white Jewish families, in order to earn a living, had to ignore the needs of their own families. Essentially, working for the Supermans meant that Lizzie May could not cook for her own family. So, as my final point, ironically or not, Southern Jewish women, active members of synagogues and chapters of the National Council of Jewish Women, or Hadassah, raised much needed money by putting together cookbooks, temple cookbooks, National Council of Jewish Women cookbooks, and the like. And in these cookbooks, they asked all the members, perhaps Superman's mother, to submit their best, finest, most cherished and tasty dishes from their homes or those of their mothers. The committees worked feverishly to put together these cookbooks, which showcase the cooking of these individual women. The so-and-so's kugel, so-and-so's knedlach, so-and-so's brisket. Okay, but interestingly, none of the recipes in the dozens and dozens of these cookbooks, okay, in these fundraising cookbooks, bore witness to the fact that African-American women had made those dishes, that it was the African-American women who had stood over the cutting boards, sinks, and stoves, and that in many cases, they actually had made up the recipe themselves. So fusing the employer's instructions on this dish or that with their own ideas of what should go into a soup or a pie or a jam or a stew. Should it be sweet? Should it be savory, fried, baked, peppery, or bland? Those decisions had been made over the course of the generations, but never do the names of those women, those domestic servants, appear in the cookbooks. Metaphorically, Stella Superman's servant Lizzie May gets no credit. So to draw this to a close, what does that say to us about Southern Jewish foodways? Well, they were never purely Jewish. So many others had a hand in shaping what Jews ate. In some ways, those contributions of others we might see as complementary. Jews chose to move to these towns. They opted for peddling. They opted for small town shopkeeping. And they made their compromises with the foods around them. They did this, and they still, however, even if they abandoned kashrut, were still active and proud members of Jewish communities. We have no idea, we have no reason to think they agonized about giving up kashrut, but we do know that their foods were very much the product of multiple people, their neighbors, and the women who worked in their kitchens, who fried and baked and broiled and preserved and roasted and barbecued for them. So thinking about Southern Jewish food historically can help us think about all migrations, all processes of community building, about the importance of food in community. And yes, we cannot ignore the enduring legacy of systematic racism. So on that note, let me thank you for your patience and hope that you have some questions.
Thank you so much for all of that information. It was very interesting. And we do have a few questions. If somebody wanted to start cooking Jewish food with a Southern flair, what type of food or recipe would you recommend?
Okay, so that's great. And so I would think about what are the ingredients. Now, in this world right now, it's so funny because you can get, strawberries in December, like you can get anything from any place at any time. It's kind of a little disconcerting, but I think what were the natural products, or what were the conventional products of Southern agriculture that I had been around really since white settlement, and some of these items actually predate white settlement. And so, I mean, think about the corn, and think about okra, and think about pecans, and rice, okay, which is an African import, and yams. And so I would say begin with the ingredients, and then ask yourself, how would, let's say, a Jewish cook, okay, who actually cared about the dietary laws, how would she make that? How would she put those items together? Okay, and certainly there are some Southern Jewish cookbooks, and I would highly recommend a book by Marcy Cohn Ferris called Matzo Balls and Gumbo, and it has recipes in it. But also, go to your local library. I don't know what would you have in your library, but and see if there's some sisterhood cookbooks. Cookbooks from Jewish cookbooks that were published and printed in the South, and see what they were suggesting.
Okay, thank you. You kind of touched on this one about, but I'm going to go ahead and ask it in case there's another answer. Is there a particular chef, cookbook, or region of food you would recommend people look up if they wanted to taste more examples of the food mentioned tonight?
Well, I think there are a number of chefs who, actually, I can say two things. First, some chefs, really quite high-end chefs who are Jewish or not, who have started playing with some Jewish type food in their restaurants, and I think they've written cookbooks. The other's a fascinating individual by the name of Michael Twitty, who is a African American. He's a well-known chef. He is a convert to Judaism, and he has been involved in a project to kind of connect his Southern African American food experiences with his Jewish, with himself as a Jew. And he gives fabulous lectures, and he's an amazing storyteller, and one really worth hearing.
Yeah, nice. As I'm about to ask the last question that I have on stock, if anyone else has any questions, remember you can ask them in the Q&A or in the chat box. There's a large population of Jewish folks living in South Florida. Has the food of the community been impacted by Florida at all? Or have you heard stories of Floridian Jewish people creating new recipes?
Okay, so that's great. And I'm going to answer that with, I'd love to know. So I think that much of the Jewish population of South Florida is transplanted from the Northeast, from New York, New Jersey. And I think that one of the things that's happened is that those individuals have brought in many of the food traditions or the food practices that they knew back in New York, the New York deli and so on. I think there was Wolfie's was very famous. I don't know if it's still there. But I would want to know, okay, what about in the cookbooks that are being written in South Florida now? How much do you see things like Meyer Lemons, okay, coming into recipes? That was never something available in New York. So I think that would be really interesting to see, to actually go and look at those documents. The other thing is that we know as of the late 50s, early 60s, there is a substantial influx of Jews from Cuba to South Florida. And there too, it's a fascinating history. And it's also a fascinating food history, because the Jews of Cuba were made up of two populations, or two migrant streams. And there were the Jews in Cuba who came to Cuba from the Ottoman Empire. Okay, and the Cubans always referred to them as Turcos, as Turks. Okay. And then as of the 1930s, there's an influx of Jews from Poland. Okay. And those are the Polacos. And so you have these two different Jewish populations in Cuba. And we know there was marriages between them, and there were all sorts of, they shared kashrut, they shared the kosher commercial zone. So I'd be first interested to know what kind of food developed in this fusion between Turkish Jews or Balkan Jews in Cuba and the Jews from Poland. What kind of fusion took place? And did the Jews from Cuba who came to South Florida bring any of that Cuban ways with them? I mean, did they continue to cook with rice and beans? For example, rice and black beans, which is really at the heart of the Cuban diet. Did they continue to make their coffee in a Cuban way? And do they play any role in the what I've seen the few times I've been to South Florida, the tremendous proliferation of Cuban food? Are there any Cuban Jews who've been involved in that process? So I would say the South Florida would be fascinating to study. And anybody here who lives there and is involved with the Jewish communal institution, it'd be really interesting to see if your, let's say, synagogue or organization has ever done a cookbook, and to just go through the pages of those cookbooks and see, what influences do you see? Again, do you see the gumbo, or do you see, other regional accommodation? Or is this kind of lock stock bringing the Ashkenazi foods from New York and the Northeast down to Florida? I'm going to presume that there has been change, and like nobody can be an expert on every Jewish food region, and the more one looks at the specific place, the more one learns.
Well, thank you so much for all of your answers and your insight and the history of the Southern Jewish foodways. We appreciate you so much. And for everyone who is still here, if y'all want to submit a recipe to our community cookbook, that is still in the chat. The link is still in the chat for the time being. I'm going to post it one more time as we close this out. But thank you so much again for doing this for us. And I hope you have a great night.
Thank you. You too. And stay cool. I know it's getting pretty hot here again.
Yes.
Okay. And stay
everyone
healthy.
else, have a great night as well.
Good. Goodbye.
Right. Bye.